It started like any other academic debate, an innocuous exchange of ideas, with a professor boldly claiming that Jesus Christ never existed. The setting? A live-streamed university seminar, streamed to an audience that numbered in the thousands. The professor, Dr. Jonathan Sinclair, had gained a small but loyal following for his controversial views, espousing theories that questioned the existence of some of history's most famous figures. But then, a name appeared in the chat, a name that would quickly become a topic of global conversation: Karoline Leavitt. Karoline, a young, sharp political commentator known for her conservative viewpoints, had recently risen to prominence for her outspokenness on several controversial issues. Her online following was sizable, but no one expected her to make a direct appearance in the live stream of Dr. Sinclair's seminar. With the click of a button, Karoline appeared on screen, her face serious but calm. "I couldn't help but hear your lecture, Dr. Sinclair," she began, her voice dripping with both politeness and challenge. "And I have to ask, what evidence do you have to suggest that Jesus isn't real? Because I think, with all due respect, your arguments are a bit more fabricated than you might realize." The chat exploded in real time, thousands of comments, memes, and reactions flooding the screen. It wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a showdown. Dr. Sinclair, momentarily stunned, adjusted his glasses and smiled slightly. "Ah, Karoline Leavitt, the conservative firebrand. So nice of you to join us. I'm not surprised that someone of your stature would have something to say about this topic. But, as I'm sure you know, history is not bound by belief, but by evidence. And the evidence against the existence of Jesus is overwhelming." Karoline's lips curled into a slight smile, and the challenge in her eyes became sharper. "Really? You truly believe there's no evidence? Let me share a few things with you." And just like that, the academic sparring had begun. But what no one knew was that this would quickly spiral into a confrontation that would stun the internet, and the world, leaving people divided, questioning their beliefs, and looking for answers in the most unexpected places. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, her voice calm but tinged with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to say would hit hard. "You're right, Dr. Sinclair," she started, "history is about evidence. And while you claim there's an overwhelming lack of it when it comes to the historical Jesus, let me point you to some facts that you might have missed in your research." She paused, her eyes briefly scanning the live chat that was exploding with anticipation. First of all, the majority of historians, whether they're Christian or not, agree on the existence of Jesus Christ as a historical figure. There are writings from Roman historians like Tacitus and Jewish sources like Josephus that mention Jesus as an actual person. They're not religious texts, but historical ones. And these are contemporary accounts, not just mythic additions made centuries later. Dr. Sinclair, though still calm, adjusted his posture, clearly prepared for the challenge but also slightly unnerved by Karoline's poise. He'd expected someone to challenge his views, but he hadn't anticipated such a well-reasoned counterattack. "I'm aware of those sources," he replied, his tone dismissive but not yet outright confrontational. "But these references are minimal at best. None of them provide any substantial evidence of the miracles attributed to Jesus, let alone the divine nature that so many claim he possessed. It's just hearsay wrapped in ancient texts." Karoline, unfazed, shot back, "Let's not confuse the issue here. We're discussing whether he existed as a person, not whether you believe he was divine. The records of his existence are plenty, but, of course, it's easier to dismiss them when you're focused on discrediting a belief system that's been in place for over 2,000 years. The chat was now in full frenzy. Comments flooded the stream, people arguing fiercely, some rallying behind Karoline, others supporting Sinclair. But the more the debate went on, the more it became clear, this was no ordinary exchange. This was turning into an intellectual war, one that would reverberate beyond the confines of this seminar. Dr. Sinclair, his ego bruised but still composed, raised an eyebrow. "I see. So you believe that ancient texts are enough to prove the existence of Jesus? Where does that leave us with other historical figures whose evidence is just as scant?" Karoline's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a confident smile. "You're missing the point, Dr. Sinclair. It's not just the texts, it's the context. The widespread movement that followed Jesus' death, the spread of Christianity, the way it fundamentally reshaped the Roman Empire, all of that speaks volumes." The chat was erupting in applause and disagreement, but the audience was now fully invested. Karoline's argument had hit its mark, and Dr. Sinclair was beginning to look uncomfortable. His intellectual stance was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a young woman who wasn't just a pundit but someone well-versed in history. Dr. Sinclair took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he faced the camera. His usual calm demeanor was starting to crack, and the tension in the air was palpable. Karoline, on the other hand, was cool, almost eerily composed as the audience watched in rapt attention. "You make an interesting point, Karoline," Dr. Sinclair began, his voice now edged with frustration. "But the fact that Christianity reshaped the Roman Empire does not prove the divinity or even the reality of Jesus as a person. This is a perfect example of circular reasoning. You're using the influence of a supposed historical figure to justify his existence." Karoline's gaze hardened, but she responded with a sharp, almost clinical tone. "No, Dr. Sinclair. What I'm showing you is the domino effect. The sheer scale of the movement that followed Jesus' death, how it spread across continents, despite intense persecution, and how it eventually became the state religion of the Roman Empire, is not something that can simply be explained away as coincidence. If Jesus was a myth, then why did so many, even non-Christians, risk their lives to spread his teachings?" Sinclair's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had been challenged before, but never quite like this. "The answer is simple," he retorted. "Because religion, in any form, is a tool for control. It's a psychological phenomenon that taps into human fear and hope. People followed Jesus because they believed in something greater than themselves, and they sought meaning in their suffering. That doesn't make it true. It just makes it powerful." The chat exploded with a new wave of reactions. Some applauded Sinclair for his intellectual honesty, while others began to rally behind Karoline, praising her for her calmness and depth of argument. But Karoline wasn't done yet. She saw an opening, and she seized it with surgical precision. "Dr. Sinclair, I think you've missed one critical aspect of this discussion. You see, history isn't just a collection of truths that we can conveniently discard when it doesn't fit our worldview. History is about human experience. And Christianity, as an idea, has had such a profound impact on humanity that it deserves to be taken seriously, regardless of your personal beliefs." Karoline leaned in, her voice lowering in intensity, yet somehow, it carried even more weight. "The truth is, people like you want to dehumanize the past. You want to believe that human beliefs and experiences are just stories that can be dismissed. But real people, many of them, from all walks of life, have felt something profound in their relationship to this story. And that's what you can't ignore. That's why, despite your academic dismissal, Jesus has had such staying power." For the first time in the debate, Sinclair seemed taken aback, his confidence faltering. Karoline had brought the conversation back to something far more personal, more intimate, and suddenly, his clinical, detached argument seemed less convincing. The internet, meanwhile, was on fire. Threads were popping up across social media, some debating the finer points of history, others simply commenting on how captivating this exchange had become. Memes flooded the screen, but the underlying message was clear: Karoline wasn't just winning the argument, she was changing the conversation entirely. "I'm not sure you understand the implications of what you're saying," Dr. Sinclair finally muttered, his voice cold. "You're suggesting that belief is somehow proof. You're turning this debate into a philosophical and emotional argument, rather than an academic one." Karoline smiled, almost pityingly. "I'm not turning it into anything, Dr. Sinclair. You're the one who's been dismissing the experiences of billions of people throughout history. I'm just reminding you that sometimes, belief, whether you agree with it or not, is part of the human experience. And that counts for something. Doesn't it?" Sinclair looked like he had been hit with a truth he wasn't quite prepared for. The camera was on him, his expression darkening, but the chat was now overtaken with a flood of admiration for Karoline. She had turned the tide. The debate was no longer just a discussion of history, it was about something far deeper. The tension between Karoline Leavitt and Dr. Sinclair was now palpable, almost electric. The debate had transcended the realm of academic exchange and had become a spectacle, a showdown that was playing out in real time for an audience of millions. The live chat was now a cacophony of voices, each side demanding attention, praising their champion. Karoline had taken control, and the internet had taken notice. Dr. Sinclair's face tightened, his eyes narrowing as he processed Karoline's final words. The digital clock at the bottom of the stream ticked away, but the seconds felt like hours as both of them stared into the camera, the weight of their arguments hanging in the air. "You've managed to turn this into a philosophical debate about belief, Karoline," Sinclair said, his voice colder than before. "But the question remains, do you have proof? Do you have any hard evidence that Jesus existed as a historical figure, beyond religious texts and anecdotal accounts?" Karoline exhaled slowly, her tone unshaken, every word deliberate. "I don't need to convince you, Dr. Sinclair. Your mind is made up. What I'm offering here is a perspective that challenges the comfortable assumptions people like you have. It's not about the absence of evidence, it's about how we interpret what we have." At this point, the viewers were on the edge of their seats. The comments section was a chaotic mix of support and opposition, but one thing was certain, the world was watching. As Karoline's words echoed through the stream, her online presence began to swell. Her followers were amplifying her message, sharing clips from the debate with fervor. They were rallying behind her, recognizing that this wasn't just about disproving a professor, it was about standing up for an understanding of history that embraced the fullness of human experience. The online discourse quickly grew beyond the debate itself. News outlets picked up on the confrontation, framing it as a clash between traditional academic skepticism and the growing populist tide of belief. Social media influencers were tweeting and posting about it non-stop, creating hashtags like #CarolineSchoolsSinclair and #TheJesusDebate. The hashtags were trending within hours. But even as Karoline's message gained traction, Dr. Sinclair wasn't backing down. "You're manipulating emotions, Karoline," he retorted, his voice rising in intensity. "You're turning this into a matter of faith, when it should be a matter of reason. The fact remains, the evidence is scarce, and your belief is based on centuries-old myths, not facts." Karoline smiled slightly, leaning back in her chair. "If believing in something that's shaped the course of history for over 2 millennia is a myth, then I suppose we could say the same about many other so-called historical figures. The difference is, some of them are convenient to ignore, and others, like Jesus, are too controversial to dismiss. And in the case of Jesus, what's controversial isn't just his existence. It's what he represented, and still represents, to so many people." Dr. Sinclair's eyes flashed with frustration, but the reality of the situation was dawning on him. This wasn't just a history lesson, this was a cultural moment. And for the first time in years, he was unsure of his place in it. Karoline had put him on the defensive, not just by using historical references, but by framing the debate in a way that appealed to the emotions and values of her audience. The power of belief, the emotional weight of a figure like Jesus, was something Sinclair hadn't anticipated. And then, it happened. The tipping point. One of the students who had been watching the stream, someone with an academic background, decided to join the debate. She was a historian, and unlike Dr. Sinclair, she was more open to the idea of taking belief seriously within historical analysis. She joined the stream, her face appearing next to Karoline's. Her name was Emily, and she had a proposition. "Dr. Sinclair," Emily said, her voice measured and calm, "the reason why we can't easily dismiss Jesus's existence isn't just the historical texts or the spread of Christianity. It's also because of the social and cultural movements that followed, movements that have persisted even into modern times. The idea that one person could inspire such sweeping change across history is extraordinary. Dismissing him as a myth is a failure to acknowledge the impact of ideas on human societies. The debate was now multi-layered. Karoline, Sinclair, and Emily were locked in a trio of ideological conflict. Karoline's supporters in the chat exploded with excitement as Emily added her academic weight to the argument, while Sinclair seemed to stiffen, feeling the pressure of this new intellectual force. Karoline's face softened, but only for a moment. She had been proven right in ways she hadn't expected, and now, more than ever, the stakes of this conversation felt higher. The stream was now at a boiling point. The digital audience, which had grown exponentially over the past few hours, was riveted by the back and forth. The screen was split in three: Karoline, Dr. Sinclair, and now Emily, the historian who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, offering a fresh perspective that only further escalated the stakes of the debate. Karoline glanced at Emily, a subtle nod of acknowledgement, before turning back to Dr. Sinclair. "You've been presenting your arguments from the standpoint of pure skepticism, Professor. But as Emily just pointed out, there are real-world consequences to the narrative we tell about history. Jesus wasn't just some figure who faded into myth. He shaped the world we live in. His influence has permeated law, culture, art, and more. Discrediting him isn't just about dismissing a religious figure, it's about rejecting a whole cultural lineage." Dr. Sinclair's face twisted in frustration. "You still fail to address the core issue, Karoline," he shot back, leaning in toward his camera. "We're talking about the existence of a man who, at best, left no tangible evidence of his existence. The only proof is a collection of sacred texts. We have no archaeological or physical evidence that verifies the miracles or the divine nature attributed to him." Emily, who had been quietly listening to the back and forth, now spoke up again, her tone authoritative yet measured. "But Professor Sinclair, we don't expect to find archaeological evidence for every figure mentioned in ancient texts. The reality is that many historical figures, great ones, too, are only documented in the same way. They left no grand physical traces, and yet we accept their existence based on the cultural and textual evidence we do have." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. To deny Jesus' existence on the sole basis of a lack of physical evidence would also mean denying the existence of many other figures in history, including people whose impact on society is undeniable. Dr. Sinclair's silence was deafening, his expression tightening with the realization that he had underestimated both his opponents, and the power of belief. This wasn't about facts alone. It wasn't even about academia anymore. Karoline had framed the conversation as a matter of cultural heritage, while Emily had grounded it in historical methodology. Together, they had created a narrative that was far more compelling than anything Dr. Sinclair had to offer. Karoline leaned forward, locking eyes with Dr. Sinclair through the screen. "The thing you don't seem to understand, Dr. Sinclair, is that facts aren't always enough. History, at its core, is about understanding the human condition. And sometimes, the belief in something, even if it cannot be proven, in your traditional sense, has more power than the coldest data." The chat exploded once again, flooding with comments from viewers who had clearly sided with Karoline. But Sinclair, while rattled, refused to back down. His pride, his intellectual reputation, was on the line. "You both are using emotional appeals to justify your positions," he said, his voice barely concealing his annoyance. "Belief is fine for personal faith, but it has no place in objective history." Karoline shook her head slowly, a hint of exasperation in her eyes. "No, Professor, belief is part of history. It always has been. Whether we're talking about religion, politics, or ideologies, belief systems have shaped every civilization on this planet. You can't just strip that out of the narrative." The back and forth continued for another few minutes, but it was clear that the energy had shifted. Karoline had seized control of the narrative, and despite Dr. Sinclair's best efforts, he couldn't regain the upper hand. The chat, the trending hashtags, the memes, it was all pointing in one direction now. Karoline Leavitt was not just a pundit, she had become a force to be reckoned with in the intellectual world. As the debate neared its conclusion, Karoline addressed the audience directly for the first time. "Look," she said, her tone now softer, but still firm, "this isn't just about defending or denying the existence of a figure from ancient history. It's about acknowledging the power of ideas and how they shape us, for better or for worse. Whether or not you believe in Jesus as a divine figure is a personal choice. But what can't be denied is the impact he's had on humanity. We're not just talking about ancient texts here. We're talking about the very ideas that built civilizations, that inspired movements for justice, that still influence millions today." The stream was silent for a moment, as if everyone was processing what she had just said. Even Dr. Sinclair, despite his stubbornness, seemed to pause and reflect, his lips pressed tightly together. Then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't a full surrender, but it was the closest thing to it. Karoline had won, but not in the way most people had expected. This wasn't about intellectual superiority, it was about recognizing the power of belief, whether or not it could be proven. As the stream ended, the digital audience erupted in applause, both for the debate and for the unexpected champion they had witnessed in Karoline Leavitt. It was clear now, she wasn't just schooling a professor, she had sparked a conversation that transcended the bounds of academia and reached into the heart of society itself. The debate ended, but its impact rippled far beyond the confines of the live-streamed seminar. Within moments, clips of Karoline's arguments were circulating across social media, reshared by influencers, academics, and casual viewers alike. Memes were made, quotes were posted, and hashtags like #CarolineSchoolSinclair and #DebateOfTheYear were trending worldwide. The internet had exploded into a frenzy over the showdown between the conservative pundit and the academic skeptic. The news outlets didn't waste any time either. Every major outlet, from conservative blogs to liberal news channels, picked up the story, with analysts and commentators dissecting the debate from all angles. For the first time in years, a seemingly niche academic debate had transcended the echo chambers of the internet and entered the mainstream conversation. Karoline's name was everywhere. She was invited to multiple news shows, podcasts, and radio segments to discuss the debate, but even more importantly, she had sparked something much larger, a nationwide discussion on the role of belief in history, the impact of culture on intellectual discourse, and how the world viewed figures like Jesus, not just as a religious leader but as a figure with a profound influence on human civilization. The response from Karoline's supporters was overwhelmingly positive. People praised her ability to hold her ground against an intellectual giant like Dr. Sinclair, not only with facts but with a clarity and conviction that felt refreshingly authentic. "She did what so many of us feel, she stood up for the truth of what belief means to us all," one supporter wrote. This was more than just history. It was a fight for the soul of our society. But of course, not everyone was so pleased. Dr. Sinclair, though silent for a time, soon issued a statement to the press. His tone was defensive, but with a trace of respect that hadn't been evident during the debate. "I stand by my position," Sinclair said in a press release. "However, I recognize that this debate has ignited a larger conversation that I believe is important. It was never my intention to dismiss people's beliefs, but rather to challenge the unquestioned acceptance of historical narratives. The fact that it has sparked such widespread discussion shows how powerful these ideas are." Despite his attempts to soften the fallout, many of his supporters felt that he had been publicly humbled. The comments and critiques from his academic colleagues were mixed. Some admired his composure during the exchange, while others questioned whether he had been too rigid in his approach. And then there were those who wondered aloud, could the debate have been won not by facts alone, but by how a figure like Karoline brought passion and personal belief into the intellectual arena? The lasting effect of the debate wasn't just Karoline's victory in the seminar. It was the cultural shift it represented. In a world where facts often seemed to be under siege and opinions were weaponized, Karoline had shown that the power of belief, of human experience, could not be easily dismissed. She had effectively bridged the gap between intellectual discourse and everyday people's lived realities. Karoline, ever the shrewd political operator, understood the weight of what had just happened. The attention she garnered from the debate wasn't just about winning, it was about positioning herself as a leader of a new kind of conversation, one where belief wasn't seen as an enemy of reason, but as an essential component of human history. Her next move. She announced a new series of public speaking events across the country, aimed at opening up dialogues about history, belief, and culture. She wanted to bring the debate to the masses, not just the ivory towers of academia. Her website crashed under the weight of traffic from people eager to hear her speak live. The hashtags continued to trend, and soon, she was the subject of an upcoming documentary exploring the shifting tides of public intellectualism. Dr. Sinclair, on the other hand, faced a period of introspection. While his reputation remained intact among his academic peers, the broader public began to question the effectiveness of his arguments, seeing them as cold and disconnected from the human realities that Karoline had so effectively highlighted. And as for the online audience, they had witnessed something remarkable. They had seen an academic giant taken down, not by the traditional means of scholarly rigor, but by the clarity and force of a simple yet profound truth: belief matters. In a world that often tried to reduce everything to mere data, Karoline Leavitt had reminded everyone of the power of the human spirit. The debate had ended, but the conversation was only just beginning. And Karoline Leavitt had emerged, not just as a political figure, but as an intellectual force, one who had taken on academia itself and reshaped the conversation for years to come. Months had passed since Karoline Leavitt's unforgettable debate with Dr. Sinclair, but its reverberations were still being felt. The world had been forced to reckon with what many had previously considered a fringe issue: the intersection of belief, history, and the role of figures like Jesus in shaping human culture. The debate had far surpassed any expectations, not only sparking widespread conversation but creating a cultural movement. Karoline, buoyed by the overwhelming response to her arguments, had turned the attention into something even larger. Her speaking tours were filling stadiums. She wasn't just talking about belief in Jesus anymore, she was discussing belief in the broader sense, how it shapes politics, history, and our understanding of what it means to be human in an increasingly complex world. It wasn't just a movement about religion. It was a movement about the strength of human conviction. At her events, she brought together scholars, historians, and everyday people to discuss how belief, whether in religion, political ideologies, or even societal movements, impacted the world. There were moments of deep intellectual engagement, but also a sense of connection among the audiences that transcended typical political discourse. Karoline was becoming a symbol of intellectual accessibility, bridging the divide between academia and the masses. Her stance had shifted the conversation not just in conservative circles but across the political spectrum. Even those who didn't agree with her religious views were beginning to understand her broader point, that the human experience could not be reduced to cold, hard facts. The power of belief, whether sacred or secular, had shaped civilizations, movements, and the very foundations of society. It wasn't just a personal victory for Karoline, it was a societal one. The debate had created a space for people who felt their beliefs, religious or otherwise, were being marginalized by elites who often dismissed them as unimportant or irrelevant. In this new environment, she had positioned herself as the defender of these beliefs, giving them a voice in spaces where they were often silenced. Dr. Sinclair, for all his academic credentials, was struggling to regain his footing. Though his stature remained intact within academic circles, his public image had been irrevocably altered. People had started to question his approach, his dismissal of beliefs that, whether factual or not, had shaped human experiences in undeniable ways. The internet, where debates often take on lives of their own, had moved on to the next viral moment, but the echoes of Sinclair's defeat lingered. Yet, despite his loss, Dr. Sinclair's career had taken a turn he hadn't expected. He had started to receive invitations to lecture on the topic of belief versus evidence at various academic institutions. His previous position, rationalist, skeptical, and rooted in objective historical methodology, was now seen as part of a broader, often contentious, discourse. His intellectual identity was evolving, and while he had been humbled, he was also gaining a new understanding of the complexities of belief. Karoline had won more than a debate. She had sparked a movement, one that was pushing the boundaries of academic thought, political discourse and cultural dialogue. In the months that followed, her face appeared on the covers of major magazines, from Time to The Atlantic. But it wasn't just her political commentary that was being discussed, it was her vision of a world where belief, in all its forms, was acknowledged as a powerful force in shaping the human experience. Through it all, Karoline remained humble. She was still the same woman who had entered that debate with Dr. Sinclair, sharp, confident, and passionate. But now, she understood something even deeper, that the power of ideas lay not in proving them with data, but in connecting them to people's lives. In one of her interviews, she was asked, "What's next for you, Karoline? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" She smiled. "The same place I've always been, fighting for ideas that matter, whether it's in politics, history, or culture. But now I understand that it's not about winning debates. It's about starting conversations that matter. Conversations that help us make sense of our world, our beliefs, and each other." And as the world watched, Karoline Leavitt's journey continued. It wasn't just about proving a point anymore, it was about changing the conversation entirely. As the months passed, Karoline Leavitt's name became synonymous with the very concept of intellectual revolution. She wasn't just an internet sensation anymore. She was a movement, a voice for the marginalized, the overlooked, and those whose beliefs were often dismissed as irrelevant in the face of modern skepticism. Her speaking tours had expanded beyond the United States, drawing audiences from across the globe. From Europe to Asia, people were eager to hear her insights on how belief shapes history, politics, and personal identity. She had managed to take a debate about the existence of Jesus and turned it into a global conversation about the role of conviction in society, something far larger than she had initially imagined. In one of her final speaking events, held in a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C., Karoline was asked by a member of the audience, "How do you reconcile the need for evidence with the power of belief? How do we balance reason and faith in a world that seems increasingly focused on one or the other?" Her answer was simple, yet profound. Reason and faith are not enemies. They are two sides of the same coin. One provides the structure for understanding, the other gives meaning. We can't reduce the human experience to one or the other. Our beliefs, whatever they are what make us human. And our reason, our ability to question and learn, is what helps us grow. They must coexist, and it's only when we try to separate them that we lose sight of the bigger picture. The room fell silent. Karoline had hit a chord, one that resonated deeply with the crowd. She wasn't just talking about religion or politics, she was speaking about the core of human existence, the struggle to find meaning in a world that often demands certainty and proof over faith and understanding. Meanwhile, Dr. Sinclair, who had once been the face of academic skepticism, had begun to adjust his approach as well. He no longer dismissed the power of belief in his lectures. Instead, he began to teach about the complex relationship between evidence, faith, and human experience, acknowledging that while his views on the historical Jesus had not changed, he now saw the broader importance of understanding belief as a driving force in history. In a public letter to Karoline, Sinclair wrote, "I have spent years dissecting history with a cold and clinical eye. But your debate has reminded me that history is more than facts. It's about the people who live through it, the beliefs that shape their world, and the stories that get passed down. Whether we like it or not, those stories matter." Karoline, in her own response, thanked Dr. Sinclair for his openness and acknowledged how far the debate had come, not just in the context of their clash, but in the way it had opened up a dialogue for everyone. "It's not about winning, Dr. Sinclair. It's about starting a conversation that leads to something better. We all have something to learn, no matter where we start." The impact of their public exchange rippled through society. Conversations about the role of belief, whether religious, ideological, or cultural, were no longer reserved for academic debates. They were happening at kitchen tables, in coffee shops, on social media, and even in government halls. People from all walks of life were starting to recognize that the ideas that shaped them were valid, even if they couldn't always be scientifically proven. In the years that followed, Karoline Leavitt continued to shape the discourse, using her platform to encourage people to embrace both their reason and their faith. She became a beacon for those who had long felt unheard, and her ability to marry conviction with intellectualism opened doors for a new generation of thinkers who believed that passion and reason could exist in harmony. By the time her final book, The Power of Belief, Reason, Faith, and Human Progress, was published, it was an instant bestseller. In it, she outlined the framework she had spent years refining, a worldview where intellectual curiosity met human conviction. The book wasn't a manifesto, but rather an invitation to think more deeply about the forces that shape history and identity. As for Dr. Sinclair, he continued his academic work, but his perspective had evolved. He frequently found himself using his platform to discuss the ways that belief shapes the narratives of history, accepting that the world was not as simple as facts versus faith, but an intricate tapestry woven together by both. And Karoline, ever the visionary, never lost sight of the most important lesson: ideas matter. Beliefs matter. People matter. Her journey had begun with a fiery debate, but it had evolved into something much larger, a new cultural movement that embraced the complexity of the human experience.